Joining me on the Crispin Flintoff show is Mohammed Akunjee. How are you doing? Not so well, I believe.
Well, it's just a bit of a bug that's going around, so it's a bit more than man flu, as some would have you believe. There we go.
Well, no, I'm sure it's really deep and painful. I can see it in your face. You don't look your normal self.
Fair play.
Now, look, the reason I wanted you to come on the show was that I thought on this show that we'd worked out what was going on in Syria. I've discussed it with Craig Murray, David Miller, Richard Medhurst, Vanessa Beeley, and it seemed to me that what's happened with the overthrow of Assad is that Israel, the UK, Turkey, um, have all worked together on this and are actually just using Syria as a land grab in some cases, or as a way of getting rid of Kurds for Turkey. It's a kind of so to sort of celebrate Assad's overthrow seems a bit bizarre from that perspective. The fact that these other people are involved, these other countries are involved. Now, I thought that was quite clear, but lots of people who are pro-Palestinian are saying that it's not such a great thing. Because I mean, obviously, the other aspect of this is that Syria was a way in which support from Iran could be reached to Palestine. It's no longer that. It's no longer there. So I'm just going to play a clip of some people who have said they don't agree with the situation in Syria being so bad after all with Assad's overthrow. The concern is that the support to the resistance in Palestine will dwindle because of Syria's being overthrown, Assad being overthrown, and a new regime that seems to be quite quiet about Israel coming in. Is that a concern to you?
It's a concern, but I know nothing about the new regime in Syria, except I know they're in a very difficult situation. They're trying to find their way out of it. But Assad was no great friend of the Palestinians. He arrested many of the Palestinian refugees in his own country. I don't see the fall of Assad as a setback for the Palestinian cause.
I mean, the situation in Syria last week, I've been asking people about that. I mean, the change, the getting rid of Assad. I mean, are you at all demoralised by that? Because obviously Syria was a helpful supply to the resistance in Palestine.
Listen, we believe in human emancipation everywhere. And there's no question, I think, that Assad was a tyrant and a murderer. And I congratulate the Syrian people for having gotten rid of him.
It seems there is some evidence, I think we need to discuss this further, that in fact Palestinians have been finding it easier to organize since the overthrow of the Assad regime. So it's not clear to me that the latest development is bad for the Syrian people and is bad for the Palestinian people. We have to remember that the fall of Assad is a good thing. It's a good thing that Assad has gone. Assad destroyed the Arab Spring, which I think many people would argue, and I would support that, was the best hope for Palestinian liberation, ever. And Assad destroyed that, and he was the most repressive, brutal ruler. So
I don't think anyone's saying that Assad was a kind, gentle man. I think people are mostly suggesting that this overthrow was made with US, British, and Israeli and Turkish support, and that therefore it's not intrinsically from the grassroots of Syria. And many of the people who were fighting were not actually from Syria, were mercenaries. I mean, that can't be good, can it? That to have mercenaries come into a country and overthrow a regime, even if the regime's not good.
I think I think that's a good point, and we need more discussion on this. But the movement, the uprising against Assad, seems to have had broad popular support. Now we'll see what the coming weeks and months brings. But I think it's too early to dismiss HTS as simply another terrorist organization. I think it's deeper than that.
Just to further highlight this kind of divisive nature of this debate, this was a tweet from Moshan Sally of Five Pillars, in which he says, I'll be recording a podcast discussing the current events in Syria, as well as a slanderous campaign of hate that has been launched against us by Assad supporters. We'll also be discussing what implications this has for our future relationships with non-Muslim and imperialist and resistance axis supporters. Now, I really hate to see people falling out in this kind of way over something that surely I'm not saying there's two sides to it, but there are valid reasons for people thinking it's not great that Assad's been overthrown. But I'm curious to know what the other side is and what you think the perspective should be from both sides. Can you resolve this?
Yeah, I think so, but it will take time. You know, the position around Assad was that, broadly speaking, after October 7th, whatever anyone's perspective on Syria or Assad particularly was, the focus wasn't on Syria. And that's the important point. The focus wasn't on Syria. The focus was on Gaza, the West Bank, and then more into Lebanon and tensions between Iran and Israel. Now, when the focus was on that, the question that's been raised and been demanded by millions of people around the world, when the focus was on Palestine, was who is coming to the aid of international law and order, which is, you know, anti-genocide, anti-war crimes. Which countries are going to do that for the benefit of the people of Gaza? And really, the only ones that stepped up in terms of a military response has been organizations that have been supported by Iran. This was Hezbollah, Hamas, Hezbollah from Lebanon, Hamas internally, and also Iran proper itself when it came to an exchange of missiles, really. So that being said, that being the axis of resistance, then generally, whatever their differences of people have been in the past, Shia Sunni divide, Syria issue of Assad, or the hegemony of Iran and maybe even Russia in the area, those were all put aside with a very clear focus, a very clear sort of moral position against genocide. But once the resistance managed to make headway in Syria, then that complicated the matter, and the focus then returned to, well, what is the various people's position on Syria, really, in terms of what should happen there. And I think it was a bit of a surprise that the rebels managed to take Damascus and push Assad out. I think most people expected that there'd be some sort of pressure from the rebels coming up to Damascus, and then there'll be some resistance to that from the existing regime and some sort of détente at some point. But once the rebels took over, then the question of Syria, what is Syria? How is it orientated towards its neighbors? What will be the nature of it? Became the focus, and people's positions on Syria then came into stark relief. So some people are pro-Assadists. That's probably a minority of people, really, just in terms of those who support Assad's regime. On its own, he didn't do himself any favors on his exit as well. Even his own family members sort of turned on him as well in that process. So they're a very small group of people who are actual Assadists. There are others who are pro-Iranian hegemony in the region. They saw that the majority of people in Syria are not going to be in favor of continued Iranian hegemony or power projection in Syria. But remember, Iran is possibly the only country that's been supporting, quote unquote supporting, that's a complex question as well, but the Palestinian cause, and its ability to support the Palestinian cause was via Assad Syria into supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon. So that had waned, or that route has been certainly weakened massively by the change. But those people who are anti-Iranian power certainly are quite angry at Assad's removal. There would be those also who are in favor of of Russian power in the region, being a good balance against perceived American power through Israel and maybe even through Turkey in the area. And they would not be happy about Assad's removal because Assad was the one that was giving Russian influence in the area any sort of purchase. And then you have people who are those who have suffered at the hands of Assad himself, and that's many, many people within Syria who form part of the various resistance groups and just the population who are very happy that Assad's gone. And then there are people who take a more pro-Turkish position, who would rather see that the more legitimate country with a right or a say in exercising its own geopolitical aspirations is Turkey, because it has absorbed so many Syrian refugees for so long and supported them. So Syria has always been a complex issue, even with the even in the previous iteration of violence in the region back 13 years ago, 14 years ago, when you had the Arab Spring, and how countries responded to the Arab Spring. So you will see there was ISIS, there was HTS, eventually there was Nusra, and you'd see that the Americans and even Israel would be anti, let's say, Nusra in Iraq, because the Americans had power in Iraq, but they would have been pro-Nusra and were pro-Nusra in Syria because they were anti-Assad. So you had a very complicated situation where external countries were supporting one group in one country and actually fighting the self-same group in another country at the same time. And so Syria has always been complex, but right now it's raised temperatures, but you know, it will get less complex in time because Assad is no longer relevant. The forces at play, Iran or Russia, are still relevant because whatever pressures there were on Assad will there also be on Giuliani. But how he orientates himself between the forces in the region, Israel, Turkey, Iran, and towards Russia or towards the US, that is why everyone should really hold their breath, because he will be working out his position amongst those competing forces as we speak.
And there's a lot you brought up there. I mean, there's one issue I'm a bit confused about, which is which you heard in some of those interviews about Assad being particularly tyrannical. Now, I've looked at some evidence that suggests that there were attempts to overthrow Assad even in the 1970s. So, or his parents. I mean, you know, the Assad family. So, I mean, that would, if there's an attempt to overthrow a regime, that would bring about a more repressive regime, because they'd be concerned that it would happen again. So that would be inevitable, that it would be more repressive. But also other countries in the Middle East, I mean, I'm thinking about particularly Saudi Arabia. I mean, are they not tyrannical? I mean, what are people not? I don't hear much about other countries being tyrannical, but Assad seems to be labeled that, or was labeled that constantly. Is that a propaganda thing to name him as tyrannical particularly, or do you think, I mean, it is justified? I'm not saying that he didn't do brutal things, but was he particularly more brutal than anyone else?
I mean, he was, as you say, he was brutal, but he's also one of the leaders who had to deal with the Arab Spring, which was an attempt to overthrow his leadership as well. And that's not often done with kids' gloves. So you'll see with Mubarak in Egypt and the Arab Spring successfully sort of having a very strong position in terms of removing that leadership, and then Morsi coming in, Sisi also. You had massacres in the streets there. So I think in that part of the world, that level of brutality is something that we've seen across all regions. Saudi Arabia, in principle, has exactly the same level of brutality, albeit they haven't had the scale of brutality across their own people, because they simply haven't had cause to have that yet. But that's not to say that we haven't seen their brutality and Britain's involvement in that as well. When it came to Yemen over 8 years, we were supplying weapons to Saudi Arabia to wipe out 600,000 people there through famine, and certainly no mercy being seen in that region. So I don't think the character of dictatorships in that region are particularly different. None of them engage in enough of a difference of brutality to say that anyone is special or isn't. There has been accusations, however, of Assad using chemical weapons in the past against Idlib with the white helmets and what have you. There's been arguments about whether that's true or not, or that was staged. But we saw the same accusations against Saddam Hussein as well, and the Kurds. So I think it's true that he was brutal. I think it's true that most of the leaders in the region are equally as brutal, but that doesn't take away that when that level of brutality is used on a population, then that leaves a mark on that population and an impetus for them to want change and want retribution for the family members and people that they've lost to that brutality. And because it was done on scale, then we can understand why the Syrian population itself has such a axe to grind against Assad in particularly the recent phase and in the last 10 odd years or so.
The other aspect of this is that the Roshan Saleh tweet, and there's some sort of feeling among some people that this is good for Muslim populations in Syria, but I'm a bit confused about this because there's this Sunni and Shia divide going on there. Now, what's your take on this whole issue here?
Yeah, sure. So there has been this discussion and power dynamic in the Middle East, which is Shia-Sunni divide, which translates into Iranian power projection and really Saudi/Sunni, arguably, power projection in the region. And generally, it's the Sunni states, the Saudi Arabia, UAE, and all these other countries who stand against or try and push against Iranian sort of power in the region. And I guess before the downfall of Saddam, Iran was very much contained to Iran/Syria in terms of its reach in terms and power, maybe also a bit in Yemen, and that's why we saw the war there, the civil war sort of rumbling, and then Lebanon after the Israelis had effectively taken control of the south of Lebanon from the 1980s. You then see Hezbollah emerge, which is certainly a wing of Iranian power projection, and then establish itself, in Lebanon basically as well. So after the fall of Saddam, large chunks of Iraq fell quite strongly into the sway of Iran. Also, they have a Shia population there. So the Sunni states, or the other Arab states, saw Iran suddenly expand its territorial influence quite strongly across quite a large landmass as well, and this has caused them to be quite nervous. Now, various groups who are fighting, you have Nusra, ISIS, HDS within Syria and also Iraq as well previously. They will have generally had a very strong Sunni/extremes Sunni interpretation of Islam and what they would want to have implemented should they be successful in establishing a state. And we saw that with ISIS had a particularly medieval and nasty approach to what one would loosely say governance, and other groups have different sort of approaches as to what they want, how they want to govern. And Gilani through HTS has talked about much more of a plural sort of form of governance and elections and bringing in various different groups with power distribution in mind. Now, that in itself is not a particularly Sunni or a Shiite thing. What it is, though, is a bit of a threat as a concept to monarchies in the region, of which all the other countries are monarchies. Saudi Arabia is a monarchy, and they see democracy as a threat to their power base. So there are groups there who, if they talk about democracy, is a threat to, and they're Sunni, they may well be seen as a threat to Iran, as a standing against Iran's hegemony power, but also they are similarly seen as, or distrusted at least, or seen as a threat also to the Sunni countries that are supporting them, because they're an example against monarchy. So you get a very complex, it's not as simple as Shia Sunni in the region, but in terms of the Muslim discussion, something that Roshan's put out there, I think that's unhelpfully divisive, I think, because most of the people who have been drawn in terms of their attention to the Middle East in the last year have been drawn on the issue of Palestine, and the vast majority of people who have been supportive of that are not of the Muslim faith. So the region now being swayed by issues of sectarian viewpoints, or at least expressed in that way, is I don't believe very helpful to anyone's cause.
I mean, I can't get over this idea that Israel is supportive of Giuliani, and he hasn't seemed to really say he's going to do anything to oppose Israel. How can it be possible to support a regime that doesn't do anything? I mean, only got in because of Israel, effectively. Only could have been in power because of Israel.
Yeah, so I mean, it's that the Israel-Syria sort of dialogue at the moment is extremely confusing, because as Giuliani is saying and putting out statements to say that he wants to extend the hand of friendship effectively to Israel, I mean, that in itself is somewhat problematic when Israel's full swing engaged in a genocide. But having seized power of a country, you could understand why one would want to have to consolidate normality and achieve normality within their own borders without having provocation of neighboring countries to deal with as well, an added complication. That's understandable. But it becomes less understandable when, at the very same time he's saying that, Israel has literally got boots on the ground in the Golan Heights, has seized more land and control of Syrian land, and has engaged immediately in the destruction of the entirety of Syria's navy, and many of its sort of self-defense military self-defense capabilities. So you have an active invader effectively within your country, and at the same time you're talking about extending the hand of peace to them. So that becomes a bit difficult for many to understand or to accept on that front. And on top of that, Giuliani has also shut down all the Palestinian training camps in Syria. So where the argument has been that Syria would be a country that is amongst nations, and if it's amongst nations, then it must orientate itself against genocide as well. But effectively, anyone who's being fair can only see that this revolution, having taken place at the time that it has had the effect that it has very much dented the Palestinian cause negatively, because the quote axis of resistance, or the flow of assistance to resistance groups in Palestine has been severely curtailed, and we haven't seen an abatement of Israel's continuing attack on the people of Palestine. In fact, just the last couple of days, we've seen an escalation in Israel's attacks within the West Bank, and certainly the West Bank. They have no excuse for doing anything in the West Bank, really. The excuse has been that on October the 7th, Hamas operated from Gaza in a way that has caused the reaction that it has from Israel. But certainly the West Bank wasn't involved in that. Hamas have no presence in the West Bank, and yet here we see Israel attacking the West Bank, and actually in I believe they'll try and annex it in the next 100 days or so.
The final question that I'm interested in is the sort of fallouts, that the arguments that amongst people in this country, especially, not people who you'd think would have any skin in the game in Syria, particularly, who are falling out, not saying they're not going to talk to each other, they're blocking each other or whatever on Twitter or whatever, arguing. Is that because of this issue, or do you think that they were just wanting an argument and they thought this is a good one? Let's go on this, because I can't understand the intensity of it. There's so much weakness in supporting Jelani because of who backs him that I can't really see how you can go right behind that. And at the same time, there were weaknesses in backing Assad to the end because of what he did in some ways. So it seems bizarre that they're falling out. Do you think it's just an excuse?
No, I don't think it is an excuse. I think that no, people do have skin in the game, and the skin isn't because of Syria necessarily. It's because of the amount of efforts and organization and resources that individuals have put in to the Palestinian cause, and so people have got very strong views about anything that may have damaged the plight of the Palestinians. So those who are who haven't got much of an interest in Syria, for example, or have no skin in the game there, well, all of a sudden, what they've seen is here's a geopolitical maneuver. And the result of that maneuver, when it comes to Palestine, which many people have invested a year of their lives in, at least in terms of their attention, going on protests and what have you, all they will see of that is that the result of this has damaged the Palestinian cause. And so quite understandably, they're quite angry about that. Others would have looked at the situation and said, look, in terms of a monopolar world with the US at its helm, that has tolerated a situation in Palestine that's gone on for 70 odd years. The Americans can't be trusted, and they cannot be trusted to put human rights or anything at the forefront. They can't be trusted to be fair. They've given carte blanche to Israel. And so a multipolar world is what one would want to see, which will at least reduce American hegemony in the area and maybe keep all the parties more honest to their so-called value systems. As in, if the Russians via Iran are challenging American power in the region, then the American proposition has to be, oh, well, we believe in freedom and human rights, and they'll have to live up to that a bit more. And that's certainly gone. That the counterpoint or counterbalance of soft power or hard power and soft power in the region has evaporated now after the fall of Assad. And so a lot of people will be angry about that because some people are very much invested in a multipolar world as opposed to a unipolar world. But I think it's right that people are emotive about it because they have been emotive about the Palestinian issue. And I think it did come out of nowhere. And so all of a sudden, there are people who look at Syria and have had skin in the game in Syria, are concerned about the blunting of the Arab Spring in Syria over the last 13 years, but have sort of mothballed that in terms of emotionally, because there was nothing happening. Assad was just in power, but when he suddenly disappeared, then their feelings towards the Syrian cause or the anti-Assad cause come bubbling up. All of those discussions that we've seen in the media with ISIS being in the region and then being removed, and Assad effectively quelling, in very brutal terms, objectively, any resistance. All of those issues that people had cared about and invested in the past suddenly has come up to the fore now, and maybe they're looking at Syrian lives not as more important than Palestinian lives, but certainly not begrudging the Syrians their chance to remove the oaks of a dictator, really, and making that as a priority over the effect it has on the Palestinian resistance. And you will see people arguing to say that, well, was Assad supporting the Palestinians at all? He could have done more. Yeah, arguably anyone could have done more. But the reality is that actually there was a there is a serious blunting in the Palestinians' ability to resist the genocide and war crimes committed to them by Israel since this event has occurred.